own microphones. And so I told him, I said, listen, if you invited me to the opening of an envelope, I'd come, because I don't get out much. But, you know, I think what they want me to talk about is why I left, the current state of politics, and then I'd really love to take questions, because I always learn more from answering questions or being asked questions than anything else. So for 18 years, you know, I was a Newt Gingrich revolutionary, elected in 1994 in the class that became the first Republican majority in the United States House of Representatives since the year I was born, 1954. And they were pretty heady times, and you know, there were 73 of us, and we had people like Sonny Bono was a member of the class, Steve LaTourette, the football player, was a member of the class. And there were a lot of articles written at the time, maybe by the Beacon Journal, that you know, they thought we were crazy. But I will tell you, I didn't know crazy till recently, and we were not crazy. But after 18 years, and I have to tell you, it's a great job. And I see Mayor Fritschel, Mayor Larson, and I get the chance to work with township trustees, mayors, city managers, city council people in the sprawling 14th and 19th congressional districts. And it was really a nice job and a good way to earn a living, and it was an honor to be returned to office so many times. And I always tell people that 18 years, I sort of decided I was never going to catch Ralph Regula, who was like 38 years. But at 18, I had decided that was enough, and I tell people that I was able to step away from the United States Congress undefeated and also unindicted, which is not that unusual in politics today. As a matter of fact, just a few years ago, we celebrated in Ohio, you know, and the Ohio delegation is a great delegation, but we celebrated 2 years ago. It was the first time in 8 years that we didn't have a member of our delegation, one a Republican and one a Democrat, in a federal prison someplace. So it was, but anyway, it's a good job, and I enjoyed it, very much. But at the end of the day, what I really liked about the job was accomplishing things, you know, and there are Republicans and there are Democrats and people who belong to the different parties. They disagree on issues, and they should disagree on issues, because that's the nature of the political system. But you weren't able to get some of the bigger things that you would like to have accomplished through the House, through the Senate, and get the president's signature on it. But you could do things that moved the country forward and did things as simple as building roads and bridges and airports and things like that. And after the 2010 election, most of that work came to a sort of a screeching halt. And it came to a screeching halt because there's a cadre of 42 people who believe, and I don't disparage them, because I truly believe they believe it, but believe that their function as a legislator is to not let anything happen. And that differs from my view. And my view always was, I don't know how many of you are married. I'm married. And if you think about your spouse, how many of you win 100% of the arguments that go on in your house? Not very many. I mean, I think I'm in the single digits as I made this trip. And so this notion that you're not going to cooperate or get along with somebody else unless you get 100% of what you're asking for is ridiculous. It's ridiculous if you're a Democrat. It's ridiculous if you're a Republican. And in your lives, in your business, in your interactions with people, you know, if you go into a discussion where there are honestly held differences and you come out with 55, 60, 70%, that's a pretty good day at the office to have worked something out, as long as the things that you're giving up don't violate some, you know, inner core principle that you know, defines who you are. But that's gone now. And so I saw bills that we used to pass with 350, 375 votes dealing with transportation. You know, I was taught when I got there, I was on the Transportation Committee, you can't leave here today and drive on a Republican road or a Democratic bridge, and so it was all about building America. You think about Dwight Eisenhower and the interstate highway system and all the wonderful infrastructure that we built in this country back through at the end of the Depression and then in through the 50s and 60s. we used to produce those bills in a way that did amazing things. And you know, one of the things that I think I had a small role in that I'm very proud of down here in Summit County was the transformation of the northern end of Route 8 from a place where you would have to stop for lights every 10 seconds to a limited access highway. And that opens up corridors for development and jobs and everything else. And that's not a partisan issue. I didn't say, you know what, Republicans want a limited access highway and Democrats want you to have to get off and stop at the light for 30 seconds. If it had worked in the campaign, I probably would have said it, but that isn't the way it went. And so all those things began to basically begin to get locked up. And if you are in public service to try and actually accomplish something, it became a very frustrating experience. Sort of the thing that put the icing on the cake, however, you all remember the fiscal cliff. And the fiscal cliff was, oh my gosh, you know, the world's going to end if we don't get out of this mess and so forth and so on. But to set the stage for where we were, I mean, in my opinion at least, the tax packages of 2001 and 2003, the Bush tax cuts, were set to expire in January of 2013. And so literally without some activity, taxes were going to go up on everybody in America, pretty much. A couple exceptions, but not many. And you remember that the president was reelected in November of 2012 pretty convincingly. It wasn't a squeaker. We didn't have hanging chads. The president convinced people that he ought to receive a second term. And after he was reelected, he was going around the country saying, look, we got these expiring tax cuts. I think that if you have done well in this country, you owe it to the country to give back a little bit more than somebody that's not doing as well. And therefore, his proposal was that we extend the tax package for those making $250,000 or less and let them expire for everybody else. I didn't think that was such a great idea, but the president was riding a wave of popularity. That's not a bad message, because clearly there are more people in the country that make less than $250,000 than there are that make more. And in an attempt to sort of wiggle and negotiate out of it, Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, sat down with Harry Reid, the majority leader, and they said, well, you know, Rich isn't $250,000. Let's make Rich $450,000. And so that was their proposal. And that was the deal that they crafted. We, in the House, we get together every Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, or I used to. And I don't know how many of you have read Dan Brown's book, The Lost Symbols. It was all about George Washington and the Masonic Temple and so forth and so on. A lot of it takes place in the Capitol. As a matter of fact, the opening scene is a murder in Statuary Hall, as I recall. And Mr. Brown describes this really weird room in the basement of the Capitol where very strange things happen. And I can tell you, there is such a room. It's HC5, and it's where the Republicans gather every Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. And so the Speaker of the House, Mr. Boehner, came down, and he said, you know, look, we need to have something to go negotiate with Harry Reid and the President on this issue. And so he unveiled something called Plan B. And Plan B would have defined that threshold of where tax cuts were going to expire at $1 million. And clearly, if you make the threshold $1 million, I believe it saved 99.982% of America from receiving a tax increase in January of 2013. Not bad ground to stand on if you're a Republican. And so the Speaker comes into the room and says, I want to do this. And it'll let me go negotiate with the President and with the Senate to come up with some kind of package. Probably won't be $1 million, but maybe 450 turns into 750, maybe it's 6, I don't know. This group of folks who had been elected in 2010, about 42 of them, said no. We're not going to give you the votes necessary to bring the bill to the floor. And again, the Republicans are in charge. You need 218 votes to do it. You can't count on Democrats to give you votes in that situation, so you had to come up with 218 votes. And they said, we're not going to give you the 218 votes. And so there was no Plan B, which is okay. Again, if you feel that Plan B was bad because millionaires would have seen their their taxes go up. You can believe that intellectually. But then it's voting day, and there's only one bill on the floor for a member of the House and Senate to vote on, and that's the deal that Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell made that sets Rich at $450,000. This same group of people were urging that there be a no vote on that deal. And I'll tell you, I didn't like the deal. I didn't think it was good enough. But where they don't sort of go and where they lose me as, I don't understand why people who hate the government want to serve in the government. I mean, there's plenty of room out there for people that hate the government to not serve in the government. But to just say no, I mean, and they were able to come back to very conservative audiences in northeastern Ohio and scream and yell about purity and principle and so forth and so on. But you have to think about what the consequence of just voting no on that piece of legislation is. If you defeat this deal that isn't so great that McConnell makes, there's no bill, and by force of law on January the 1st, taxes go up on 100% of America. Now, you can't explain to me, I mean, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but you can't explain to me how that is preferable to saving some Americans from receiving a tax increase on January the 1st. And then you sort of fast forward, and I was gone, thank God, for the 16-day government shutdown. And, you know, I have to tell you, I'm not a big fan of the Affordable Care Act. I voted against it. I voted to repeal it. I think by the time I left the House, I'd voted to get rid of it 38 times. They're up to 50 now. So I really don't think that anybody who looks at my voting record is confused about how I feel about the Affordable Care Act. But a senator from Texas decides that he's going to use the full faith and credit of the United States of America and the continued funding of government as the linchpin to force the president and Harry Reid to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. And so he does a 21-hour filibuster on the House floor. He quotes Dr. Seuss. He tells a lot of cute stories about Texas, which I didn't know there were any cute stories about Texas. But and at the end of the day, guess what? The government shut down for 16 days. People are displaced. Services are discontinued. And then the government has to reopen. And so there's a vote to reopen the government. And again, I don't have a problem. If you're not a fan of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's called, then that's okay. I mean, I'm in that boat. But to affect it legislatively and understand that in the split form of government, for whatever reason, Americans have determined that they like the split form of government. They like Republicans keeping an eye on Democrats and vice versa, because quite frankly, they don't trust any of us. And so you got to keep an eye on people. But to think that by doing this filibuster for 21 hours, shutting down the government and denying the votes necessary to fund the government for 16 days, that all of a sudden, Harry Reid is going to say, okay, you got us, and let's get rid of it. Or that President Obama down in the White House, and you could argue that the Affordable Care Act is a pretty significant accomplishment in his presidency, is all of a sudden going to say, Cruz, you're right, this is a horrible law. Let's get rid of it and reopen the government and everything's okay. So it's just not, it's not realistic. It's great for bumper stickers. It's great to rile up a crowd. It's great to feed red meat to a certain audience. What it's not is governing. And for me, that's the set of consequences that even though I very much enjoyed the job, I decided to punish my longtime friend David Joyce and have him be the congressman for a little while and see how he likes it. But because I can't get away from it enough, Michael mentioned that one of the things that I'm doing is running something called the Republican Main Street Partnership. The Republican Main Street Partnership was founded in the 1990s, no matter what you read in the newspapers, I didn't create it, by a fellow by the name of Amory Houghton Jr. Amory Houghton Jr. was the former president and CEO of Corning Glass in Corning, New York. He was and is the only president and CEO of a Fortune 500 company to ever hold a seat in the United States House of Representatives, which really should tell you all you need to know about the House of Representatives. He determined that there was a rightward drift to the Republican Party, and that we were becoming, because of Nixon's Solid South strategy, becoming a party that was more defined by the red states below the Mason-Dixon line and historical Republican strongholds like New Hampshire and New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio needed to have a voice, that a Republican doesn't necessarily in Ohio look like a Republican does in Texas, thank God. And so it began as sort of a think tank where we would produce thoughtful papers and ideas and position papers and so forth and so on. But then in about 2006, this is just before the Tea Party, there became a sort of an upshoot of organizations that I call Purity for Profit. And they are Washington-based operations that will send letters asking people to send them money. And the premise is that you have to send them money to protect the purity of the Republican Party. And they establish these litmus tests that they think up in their own head as to what makes a good Republican, what's a bad Republican. They coined the phrase RINO, Republican in name only. And they made a determination that rather than sort of the historic political controversy that you would have in November, we were going to have primary elections where the real Republicans were going to run against the rhinos. And what they would do, the first time I really perked up and paid attention to it, there was a fellow who represented the Eastern Shore of Maryland, if you're familiar with the Eastern Shore at all, out Route 50. There was a guy, a Republican, who held the seat. His name was Wayne Gilchrist. Wayne actually walked the jungles in Vietnam as a sergeant in the United States Army. He was an ordained minister. He was a Republican. But because of the Eastern Shore, he happened to like preserving wetlands and green space. That was important to him. It was important to his constituents. Well, these purity for profit guys decided that Wayne was not a real Republican. And so Wayne wouldn't take PAC money. He believed he wasn't going to accept a donation from any PACs. So he raised all the money from individual donors, which is a nice principle, but it's really stupid in Washington. I mean, if you don't have, races are expensive today. And so a group called the Club for Growth came in and spent thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars painting Wayne as a bad Republican. Now, he lost. The Republican who was nominated lost to the Democrat, and so for the first time in a very long time, a seat that had historically been held by the Republican Party was now held by a member of the Democratic Party. And you saw that repeated in some very famous examples in the last couple election cycles. In the Senate, for instance, the only person in Missouri that Senator Claire McCaskill could have beaten was a guy named Todd Akin. And Todd Akin, because of this purity for profit operation, was the Republican nominee. And we all knew, because I served with Todd, and Todd's a very pleasant fellow, but sometimes he talks about stuff he should probably not talk about. And when he went on television and talked about legitimate rape, and that didn't go over so well, you know, particularly with women voters in Missouri, and Claire McCaskill's reelected. Richard Murdoch in Indiana. Now, Dick Lugar made a big mistake by not actually living in the state of Indiana for a number of years, but few people could argue with the fact that he was one of the most respected experts on foreign policy that we had in the United States government. And they run Richard Murdoch, and Richard Murdoch has to one-up Todd Akin and not only talk about a situation of rape, but talk about the fact that the child conceived as a gift from God, and that didn't go over so well with a lot of women voters. In Delaware, a very good friend of mine, Mike Castle, served with me on the Financial Services Committee, a very conservative, fiscal conservative, maybe not a social conservative. They nominate Christine O'Donnell. And I never thought that I would live long enough. I'm 59 years old, I've been a Republican all my life, that I would see someone running under the Republican banner for the United States Senate, and they put up their first television ad, and the first words out of her mouth are, "I am not a witch." That's not a successful campaign. It's not going to work. And so you can be pure, you can be uncompromising, but I would suggest to you that if you're going to be both of those, you can't govern. And so our group, even though it's been mischaracterized and so forth and so on, I made the decision that we would add another arm to what Amo Houghton started. And that is to raise funds to go in and defend sitting Republican members who have been targeted by these groups that say they don't measure up as good Republicans. And that's all we're doing. And you would have thought that, I don't know what people say I'm trying to do, but we're not going after any sitting Republicans. We're not doing anything but saying, it's not for you. It's not for you, Club for Growth, Heritage Action, Freedom Works, sitting in Washington, D.C., to determine who the congressman should be in the 14th District of Ohio. It's for the people in the 14th District of Ohio to make that determination. And to let somebody come in with hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of dollars, to Bigfoot a race, to skew the primary election in favor of the more conservative candidate because the other candidate is outgunned, I don't think it's right. So that's what we're engaged in. And at the moment, because they had a huge failure of recruitment, we're only actively involved in two races. That'll grow as more filing deadlines come. But one is in Idaho 2, where we're defending a guy named Mike Simpson against the Club for Growth. They just put another $200,000 on television this morning as I was waiting to come down here today. And if there is no defense or air cover for Mike Simpson, you're going to get somebody else. And the other race that I really wanted to avoid is my old seat, David Joyce, where Freedom Works has come in and determined that Congressman Joyce is a Rhino and he needs to be removed. And he needs to be removed by a state representative whose name is Matt Lynch. But let me, without being too mean, let me just say something. I am probably, if you look up on the internet, I am probably the #1 Rhino in America that these groups are targeting. But if you look at the 18 years that I served in the United States Congress and the 15,000 votes that I cast, my loyalty rating in terms of votes, not the speeches I gave, was 92%. I have a 92% Republican. I stayed true to the Republican vote 92% of the time over the 18 years. Mr. Lynch, and they call me a Rhino, Mr. Lynch, who's running against David Joyce, in his one term in the Ohio legislature, has voted 60% of the time with Chris Redfern, the chairman of the Democratic Party. But he's a patriot. I don't get it. I mean, I really, really don't get it. So we're involved in that race. We'll be involved in a couple of others. And you know, the last thing that I'll say before I answer your questions is, if the Republican Party doesn't somehow figure out a way to get on the right side of the demographic equation here, we're going to have a problem. Because you can't say, I mean, I've been involved in a lot of elections, and I would tell you I would not have won one if I said, okay, let's look at Lake, Geauga, Summit, Ashtabula, Portage, Trumbull counties. And if I can just get all of the really angry 57-year-old white guys to vote for me, I'm going to win. It doesn't work that way. And you cannot on election day give up women, give up African Americans, Asian Americans, Jewish Americans, Hispanic Americans, gay Americans, and say you're going to win this election. It's not going to work. And so the party is at a point where you can make a decision to be a permanent majority because of gerrymandering and some other things in the House of Representatives, but never again elect a Republican president of the United States and never control the United States Senate in a way that you can actually pass some legislation. So I don't believe that, for instance, you have to not like clean air, clean water, preservation of green space to be a Republican, but there's some who take that view. I don't and never took the view that every person who belongs to a labor union is an enemy of the Republican Party. If you look at the demographics of the building trades in particular, about 42% happen to be Republicans, the members of these trade unions. And what people, the purists, sometimes forget, everybody in the Republican Party holds up Ronald Reagan as the gold standard, but I would tell you that if you truly look at all aspects of President Reagan's record, yes, he took individual income tax rates from historic highs down to where we are today, roughly. But when those tax reductions didn't generate enough income to run the government, he also presided over 11 tax increases. My purist friends forget the second part of that. On the day that John Hinckley was waiting outside the Washington Hilton on Connecticut Avenue to shoot President Reagan, he was leaving the Building Trades Convention, where he had just endorsed the federal prevailing wage law. And if you look at how I got from 100% to 92%, I also think that federal prevailing wage is not a horrible idea. So until we make a decision that we're going to figure out a way to get to yes. I mean, it's easy to get to no. I mean, if you ask me a question, I could tell and say yes, no. Tell all of you no here today. That's easy. That doesn't take a lot of thought. It is the art of being a legislator and being thoughtful to try and figure out where's the common ground, how can you move the country forward without violating your core principles and still govern the country. And so that's kind of what I do in my non-paying night job. It's going well, and again, at the end of the day, it's not an attack on the Tea Party. The Tea Party, look, very vibrant force that brought a lot of energy to the 2010 election, but the Tea Party is not the Republican Party. The Tea Party is the Tea Party. And the Republican Party needs to be bigger than that if it's going to represent the entire country. And then last thing, I promise it's the last thing, we got to get our heads around this redistricting process. And let me just give you two snapshots. On the east side of Cleveland, a lovely woman by the name of Marcia Fudge represents the east side of Cleveland, also the west side of Akron, just to show you about redistricting. And her district scores at something called a D plus 36. That means on election day, Ms. Fudge, Congressman Fudge, can lay in bed and her base vote is 86% of the vote. What motivation does she have to find the Republican point of view in an issue? And where is her electoral threat? It's not in November. It's in May, in the primary, when someone runs to her left and says, Marcia, you're not a good enough Democrat. And the same thing happens with Republican districts. There's a pretty conservative guy to the west of us, Jim Jordan. I believe his is a R plus 18. That means on election day, 68% of the vote is his base vote. And you really have to screw it up if your base vote's 68% to not win that election. So what motivation does he have to reach out to Marcia Fudge and find something that they can agree on? And I would tell you precious little. And so until that issue becomes something that people actually care about, talk about, want to do something about, the House of Representatives isn't going to dramatically shift. And, you know, I've made fun of a lot of people I served with, but I will tell you that the ultimate responsibility rests with the people that send these people to Washington, D.C., and in many instances, the people are representatives. They are reflective of what the people in their districts are thinking or asking them to do. And you know, the big change that I saw is in the news reporting, where you can't turn on the television and have anybody tell you what happened. I mean, somebody always will tell you that this happened and it's George Bush's fault, or this happened and it was Barack Obama's fault. And people, you know, now watch news programs based upon what they're already thinking. So if you're a Republican, you know, you watch Fox News and you're able to go, hey, Martha, I must be right. Sean Hannity agrees with me, so, you know, I'm thinking clearly. And if you're a Democrat, you sort of skew towards CNN and the same thing. And I like to say, if you're a communist, you watch MSNBC and you get your news. That's not true. It's a lovely network. But anyway, we have to figure this out. We have to fix it. I'm honored to be here today. It's nice to see some of you that I've seen before. It's nice to meet those of you that I've not met before. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. But thank you for having me.
Good afternoon. I'm Bruce Wingus. You know, I brought my own questions, but you all brought a lot more, so we're going to do those.
Water.
If you could, where could you go?
Thank you. I'm here.
Yeah, okay. Briefly describe what you think the Republican Party will look like by 2020.
Yeah. Well, what the Republican Party is going to look like is really what happens over this next little bit. 2014 midterms are going to be critically important. The presidential election in 2016 is going to be critical. And a lot of this jockeying, I'm just a small little bit player in this drama, but there is a tug of war going on for what is the Republican Party, what should it stand for. Are we going to become an exclusive club that has litmus tests on whether you're a good Republican or a bad Republican? Or are we going to become more tolerant and inclusive of people who like things like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, or, you know, wetlands, or things of that nature? And it's to be written, I think. If the party continues upon this path to hew to the extreme right, it will, I fear, become a permanent minority party that will not achieve the White House in the near future. And now, I would say that the party is, in fact, thinking better, in that, you know, Cleveland's in line. I'm sorry it's not Akron, but Cleveland's in line to be the host city for the Republican National Convention in 2016. And the fact that they're thinking about Cleveland is a step forward. And so here's a little factoid to put in the back of your head. If there had been a 13% vote shift in Cuyahoga County in 2012 away from President Obama to Mitt Romney would be the President of the United States today. And so Cuyahoga County is critically important to the Republican base and the strategy in Ohio and the strategy across the country. But they're also talking about moving it up. So you don't have this, my own view that nobody has to agree with, but is when you put Mitt Romney on the stage in 37 debates or whatever with people that really shouldn't even be on the stage. I mean, I served with Michelle Bachmann. Nice person, but there was no way she was going to be the Republican nominee. And I turned to my wife, Jennifer, on the debate, the third debate that the president had with Mitt Romney. And the question was one that I'd seen in the Republican primary debates. And the question was, if you were brought a deal where you could get $10 of spending reduction, spending cuts in the federal budget for $1 of revenue increases, would you take that deal? And everybody in that cattle call of Republican candidates said no, except John Huntsman, the former governor of Utah. And Mitt Romney then was locked into that answer. Well, that's the dumbest answer I ever heard. And anybody who's run anything that says that you can get a 10-to-1 proposition and you're going to turn it down to save the country, to save the mess we're in, and you're going to walk away from it, that doesn't sell on Main Street. That doesn't sell with most people that I know. And for me, the election was over. So by moving the convention up, having less debates with these sort of fringe hanger-on candidates, the party can do it. But we have to, last thing about this. So when I got there, I think we had 12 members of Congress from New York. We had 2 from Massachusetts, if you can believe it, Janet. 2 Peters, Torkeldsen and Blute. I remember their names from 20 years ago because it was so rare. We had both seats in New Hampshire. We had Delaware. We had a nice swath of the Philadelphia suburbs in Pennsylvania. And that's all gone today. We don't have one Republican representative in all of New England. So how can you be a national party if you don't represent the nation? New York got so bad, New York is a pretty big state, a lot of electoral votes. It got so bad that the year I was leaving, it was down to 2 Republicans, a guy named Peter King, who you see on television every once in a while, and a guy named Chris Lee. And so we used to call him the King and I, because that's all there was in New York. But then it got worse than that because Chris Lee decided that it would be a good idea to take off his shirt and take a selfie and try and pick up a woman on Craigslist. And so he resigned, and we were down to just the King. We didn't even have the I anymore. So we're at a crossroads. And so, as a lifelong Republican, I will tell you, it's a little bit, thank you for not booing that I went to the University of Michigan, by the way. But it's a little bit like the University of Michigan and the Ohio State University. I think the Big Ten is better when both schools can put a good quality product on the field and not almost lose to Akron. And it makes the conference stronger. And I think 2 strong major political parties make the country stronger. It's not good to have a weak sister that always gets beat up on. So I'm optimistic that we'll get there from here, but we got a choice to make, and I can't tell you which choice we're going to make.
You spoke about gerrymandering and its effect on politics. What do you see as a solution for that in Ohio here?
Mm-hmm. Well, here's the problem with fixes. There was a ballot initiative, I think it was issue 3 a couple years ago, and all it was, in my opinion, was an attempt by the Democratic Party to change the rules so it favored them instead of the Republican Party that it favors because of the election. So I didn't think it was but that's the problem. A lot of the reforms that people come up with, it's not really a reform. It's how do I make it so I win rather than you. Something that I'm watching pretty closely is what they've done in California. And I think that there have not been enough election cycles to say whether it's good or not. But they have this thing known as a jungle primary. And so everybody runs, Republican, Democrat, and the top 2 vote getters, and they can be in the same party, then go into the general election. So you can have 2 Democrats, you can have 2 Republicans, you can have 1 of each. And what that causes, and in the very safe seats that I was describing before, if you did it in Cleveland, for instance, I can almost guarantee you that the top 2 finishers would be Democrats. What that forces in the November election is who's going to decide who the congressperson is. And it's going to be the independents and the Republicans who didn't vote in the primary. And I believe that in order to attract those votes, you have to moderate your position. Because the independents, the one thing I know about independents, is they don't like extremes. They don't like conflict. They don't like problems. And one of the things that amazed me, we were doing such a great job in the House in 2006 that the voters threw us out and put Mrs. Pelosi in as the Speaker for 4 years. And I remember going to this HC5, the room in the basement where the weird stuff happens, and I'd seen the numbers, and the numbers said that 58% of the independents left us and voted for a Democrat for Congress that year. That's pretty simple to me. But the speeches that started flowing were, we were not true to our core principles. We didn't have enough votes on abortion. We didn't have enough votes on guns. We didn't have enough votes on gays. I don't know what planet these people were living from, but that isn't what the evidence showed. But then the same thing, I can tell you, just to show that crazy is in both parties, In the 2010 election, when the Tea Party wave removed Mrs. Pelosi and reinstalled the Republicans and John Boehner as the Speaker, in that same room, according to my Democratic friends, I've not been invited to their meetings, said the same thing was happening. That the progressive wing of the Democratic Party said the only reason we lost is because we weren't bold enough on the Affordable Care Act. We weren't bold enough on cap and trade. We weren't bold enough on Dodd-Frank. We didn't spend enough money in the stimulus bill. Well, that's crazy too. And if you look at the votes from that, 58, yes, there was a big Tea Party energy, but 58% of the independents left the Democrats and voted for the Republicans. It's really not complicated.
Here's a campaign finance question. How can the cost of campaigns be reduced to prevent more citizens an opportunity to run and serve, to give them more opportunity?
Yeah, I don't know, because there's something known as the First Amendment gets in the way, and a Supreme Court called Buckley versus Vallejo that needs to be adjusted, that deals with the issue of money being equal to free speech, that if you have a lot of money, you get to talk a lot more than I do. I mean, it's the basic First Amendment principle in the Supreme Court case. I don't get it, but that's the law of the land. And so actually, when I was driving to the airport to leave Washington yesterday, I guess John Paul Stevens, the retired Supreme Court justice, is coming out with a book. And in it, he's suggesting 6 amendments to the Constitution, and one of them has to do with campaign finance. And the fact that we have to do something about Buckley versus Vallejo to do something about the churn of money in politics. And you know, many of you in the room may remember a fellow who was my mentor, Bill Stanton, represented part of this area for 18 years before he retired. And his last election was 1980, and I said, Bill, you know, how much money do you have to raise to run for Congress, and how much money did you raise? In 1980, which, I mean, it's not, some of you weren't born, but most of us were, $30,000 is what it cost to run for the United States Congress in America in 1980. Today, the average is each candidate will raise $2 million. And what I was describing about these super PACs is, and you don't have to go far to see that. I mean, one of the most expensive races for the House of Representatives occurred right in here in your backyard when they put Congressman Renacci against Congresswoman Sutton, drew their districts together. I think the price tag was something like $35 million. And the candidates only raised 4, 5, or 6 of that. The rest of it came in $1 million chunks from ideological groups on the right or the left. And so the first thing, you got to fix Buckley versus Vallejo. I voted for something called McCain-Feingold a long time ago because I thought that would fix some of what was going on. It was billed as that's going to be the fix to the problem. But all it did was, in my opinion, take the elections out of the hands of the candidates and the parties and give it to other people with a lot of money on the right or left. And it started with what were called 527s, and now it's super PACs. I mean, as my grandmother used to say, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a super PAC. Everybody's got a super PAC. And it doesn't take anything to start a super PAC. You just have to have $1 billion in the bank and be willing to write a very big check. And under the First Amendment and Buckley versus Vallejo, in my opinion, that gives you, by virtue of having a lot of money, a disproportionate voice in the democratic process. But until we fix the Supreme Court case, we can't do it.
We've got some students in the audience. What advice would you give them if they want to become more involved in politics?
I thought I was going to be run for office, and I was going to say run for your lives. Well, listen, I used to answer this question for the school groups that came to see me, and no disrespect to Ryan and others who are engaged in the study of political science, but I'm a big believer in English, and because I think you can almost be anything you want to be in this country, if you can master the written and spoken word and are able to communicate ideas to others, I think you can be whatever you want. And I certainly think that those are skills that serve you well in public life. I know that That's what I attempted to do. And, you know, again, you can be the brainiest person in the room and have this really great idea that's going to, you know, solve world hunger or bring world peace or whatever. If I can't get it out of my mouth in a way that you understand, accept, and buy into it, it just is the greatest idea that's stuck in my head. So I think the art of communication is important. But then on just the nuts and bolts, you gotta decide whether you have the fire in the belly. It's not for everybody. It's a contact sport, and you have to be. And I'll tell you a story about my daughter in a minute. But you have to be willing to say that I love this, and I'll tell you I do love it. I mean I love the process. I stay up on election night. I crunch numbers all day long. I'm a geek when it comes to this stuff, but it isn't for everybody. And so I started out, I had a friend at Cleveland Heights High School. His mother was the mayor of Cleveland Heights. I started out by going door to door for her, finding her sign locations, doing a phone bank, licking envelopes, standing at the polls. Then I became a precinct committee person, and then as I was telling Ryan that, you know, after you're involved so long, people come to you and they say, well, you should be a candidate. You're really good. And those people aren't your friends, by the way, when they tell you that. But and that's how you learn it. And the other mistake that people make, I think, is that everybody wants to start on top today. I mean, being a legislator, being a public servant, despite the fact that people make fun of them all the time, is a profession. And just like any other profession, you know, if you were going to go have open heart surgery at Summa later today, you probably want the guy with a little gray hair and not the kid with the pimply face that just, you know, got his degree off of a matchbook. And it's the same thing in legislating. I mean, you become a legislator, and I can tell you I was a much better legislator in year 18 than I was in year 1. But you have to have the fire in the belly, and you have to believe at the end of the day that what you're doing is worthwhile, and you're at least attempting to help people in a way that you think is right.
You talked a little bit about the environment. How can EPA regulations be changed to allow the United States to return to its strength rather than having other countries replace our standings?
Yeah, I'll tell you. I mean, this is one of those whipsaw issues that used to drive me crazy. I mean, I happen to. I think Michael in his introduction. I love Lake Erie. I spent a lot of time working on Lake Erie water quality issues, the Great Lakes Compact. A lot of work on invasive species, and you know, if you really want to know about how good that work is, go sometime and to an aquarium and look at a fish tank that has a sea lamprey in it that's like latching onto another fish, and you won't go swimming for a while. You probably won't drink any water for a while. And you know, the greatest threat up there now is the Asian carp. And if it jumps the barrier there in the Detroit River, we're going to have a big problem. We're going to have a big problem because the Asian carp eats 40% of its own body weight every day. Now, that's something that I personally admire, but not in a fish necessarily. And so, you know, regulations that protect air quality, lands, water, everything, I'm all for that. You do have, I would say, in this administration, an activist group of people that want to control stuff that they have no opinion controlling in a way that is making us, puts us at an economic disadvantage to other countries around the world. And let me give you just one example that really is my favorite example. So they're not in the district, but with spring coming, many of you in the room may use Scott's products, the grass seed people. And they also make fertilizer and a whole bunch of other stuff. The previous administrator of the EPA, Ms. Jackson, Lisa Jackson, was promulgating a regulation that wasn't going to control the pesticides or whatever they put in fertilizer, but the EPA was about to announce a regulation that was going to determine what they could call their product. And specifically with Scott's, they went to them and said, you got this turf builder plus. So we don't think you can substantiate what the plus is. And so we think that's misleading. And so you can't say plus, which, what does that have to do with the EPA? And they came out with a list of words that fertilizer companies shouldn't use in their trademark names. I mean, some of these have been trademarked for years. And one of the words that they were prohibited, if the regulation had made it, was going to be green. Now, look, I don't know how you talk about grass unless you can talk about green. I mean, it's a color. But they said that unless the green that you're talking about has to do with livability and sustainability, you can't use green. There's a company in Toledo, Anderson's Golf Pro, and they went to them and said, well, I could use your grass seed in my front yard, not just for golf courses. So you should take the word golf out of it and just call it Anderson's Pro. And you may not be able to use Pro because you don't have to be a professional to spread it. So it'd just be Anderson's. And so we had a little hearing, and I did my level best with some of my colleagues to get Ms. Jackson to back off of that and some other regulations that just don't make sense. And they wouldn't do it. And so we had a hearing, and I brought in my favorite Scott's product, Scott's Miracle Grow. And I said, listen, Ms. Jackson, this is called Miracle Grow. If I put this on my tomato plant, I'll bet I can't establish to you that a miracle has occurred. And what you're going to do is really foster a lot of commerce between here and Rome, because all these little Italian ladies are going to be taking their tomato plants on the plane to go over to Rome to see if, in fact, a miracle has occurred. So, like anything else, I mean, this is common sense, and people need to regulate things to prevent or to protect public health and our natural resources. People don't need to regulate everything that moves. But that goes back to the partisan thing. If the question and the questioner, you could have positive, common sense legislation that deals with overreaching regulation if you weren't being crazy on everything else. But once you're crazy on everything else, it just gets thrown into the hat of crazy. And so as a result, it is something that if you talk to Joyce or Renacy or Marcia Fudge, you'll get a receptive audience, and I believe they'll try to do the right thing, but it's not easy.
You talked about students. Besides voting, what can the average citizen do to affect change in a positive way in our political system?
Yeah, well, the simple one is vote. The other one is when I was talking on the student question is to get involved somehow. A lot of people take the Al Bundy approach to running the country, where they'll just sort of sit on the couch and put their hands down their pants and watch television and complain about the government. You do get the government you deserve, and those who participate have a chance to shape it. But on the issue that I was trying to address in my talk is what always used to drive me crazy is people would come in, and if they didn't think I was doing something that they thought was the right decision, they wouldn't even talk about it. They'd just say, well, we just came to thank you, Congressman, for this and that and the other thing and so forth and so on. And then they'd go out in the hallway and say, that son of a gun, he voted. People need to hear that you expect them to get along and get something done. And that message isn't really delivered a lot in Washington. I mean, there should be an expectation that if we send you to city council, or if we elect you mayor, or if we do whatever, we have an expectation that you're actually going to do something positive. This group of naysayers, again, this group that thinks that it's okay, and they get mad at me because they say, being in government and just pushing the no button all the time. I don't know how many of you watched this vote in the House of Representatives, but it's a little box, and it's got green, red, and yellow. And yellow's for attendance every once in a while, but it's green or red most of the time. And you could send a monkey to Washington, by giving him a couple bananas if he just, every time he hit the red button, here's a banana for you. That doesn't take a lot of thought. And to vote 100%. One of the things that amazed me, and this happens in both parties, is they'll come home in a primary and say, I voted 100% of the time with my party. Well, again, that doesn't require a lot of independent thinking. But telling people that you expect more of them, because until that happens, until there's a consequence for being an extreme ideologue on either the left or the right, it's never gonna change.
Okay, we have time for one final question. Which do you prefer, being on the Sunday morning talk shows or the Comedy Central Jon Stewart?
Well, I have to say I like the Jon Stewart thing the best, because I think they're funny. But people got mad at me about that too. And my wife always says I could get in trouble in an empty room. So, but I think it's important. I do think that and I would like to be out of business. So I'll tell you, I debated Chris Chicola, who's the president of the Club for Growth, and at the end of the debate, and this is a little bit of a sucker game, but I said, so I'm on track to raise $8 million to defend Republican incumbents. I'll tell you what, I'll give it all back. Anybody that's given me money, I'll give it all back if you just stop attacking sitting Republican House members in primaries. And of course he said no, because it was a sucker bet. But I'd very much like to be out of the business. And in America, if you're a Tea Party believer and you want to run for office, God bless you. That's the way the country is. If you're not, God bless you. If you're a Democrat, God bless you. But to permit people to shift the playing field based upon some artificial scorecard, litmus test, it's not right. And so until I see that change, I'm going to continue to do it, and we'll give it our best shot. Thank you.